Hello, greetings. Welcome to our webinar on going back to school after COVID. So this is a series of webinars brought to you by school counselors for MTSS. We're so glad you're here with us today. And as you can see, if you like this information, you're welcome to follow us on social media, both Facebook and Twitter. So our next slide, to tell you about ourselves, school counselors for MTSS. My name is Emily Goodman-Scott, and I'm pleased to be a part of this group. We have been meeting together as a whole, I think 5 to 6 years now, but we are a group of folks that are former school counselors, as well as formerly involved in our school's MTSS or PBIS efforts. For example, I loved being an internal coach at my elementary school, and now turned school counselor educator. So getting to teach the next generation of school counselors and do research and writing and all types of fun things, along with my group, Jen, Peg, and Jake. And Jen is on the webinar with us today as well.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Betters-Bubon. And like Emily, I have been involved in MTSS efforts as a former school counselor, both an internal and external PBIS coach. I am very passionate about MTSS and really excited to be here to talk with you about how to utilize system strategies as you think about heading back to school.
And as you can see from our book here, we have a book, and this book is talks about just general alignment between running a comprehensive school counseling program such as the ASCA model and MTSS. And we are the only book that covers K through 12, all levels and all tiers, 1, 2, and 3. So for more information, we have information about our book, as well as we've done a number of research articles and whatnot that's on our website. So for more information. So now we'll go ahead and jump in. So today we are, as I mentioned, we have a number of webinars that we've put out for free. They're short, they're bite-sized, 20, 25 minutes in response to COVID. So this has been a really interesting and unique time. And as a group, we thought, what can we do to help school counselors? You're there, you're on the front line. So we have a number of webinars in the series. This is the 4th one out of 5. So the previous ones that are currently on our website and free and available, we have one on just general, what does school counseling look like? Aligning school counseling and MTSS using in a virtual world. That was our first one. Our second one had to do with crisis. Our third one had to do with grief. And the one today talks about reintegration. So part 1 of reintegration, using that systems approach. And then our last one, Jen, will be doing, and will roll out the next week, and that will be using a trauma-informed lens for that reintegration. So talking about how to be trauma-informed in your practices at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So next, what we have for you is a refresher, very quick refresher before we jump into this reintegration. So what is MTSS? As you all know, MTSS is a framework. It's prevention and intervention. And as we know, over the years, we previously, like when I was in the schools, we had PBIS and we had RTI. But now more and more states, in fact, I think almost all states are doing more of this combination. Instead of only looking at students in regards to behavior or only academics, we're really combining instead to do MTSS, which is an overarching framework for all 3. And as you can see from the next slide, we have done a lot of work. Our group here is we have thought to ourselves, all right, schools are implementing MTSS. What does that mean for us as school counselors? So we looked at the ASCA model, knowing that we're called to implement comprehensive programs as school counselors. And we said, okay, what school counseling activities are we doing for all, or Tier 1? What are we doing for some, or Tier 2? And what are we doing for few, which is at Tier 3? And this is a Blake exercise we often do with our graduate students or the school counselor. And as you see on this next slide, we have a completed image. And so this image are the activities that we do at the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 levels, generally speaking. And we have a free download of this available. I believe it's either on our website or a free download on Teachers Pay Teachers. But again, that's something for you. A lot of folks have found helpful to look at how do we conceptualize our role as school counselors and how does that align with MTSS. And then this next slide here When we look at MTSS, we also think about what we do in regards to, we look at systems, data, and practices. And I just talked about the practices piece for you all. So practices meaning that what we're doing according to tier, but we use data to drive our decisions. We also use systems. And a big piece of our conversation today is to talk about that systems lens as we think about going back to school. So that's really the highlight. So next slide is when we think about where we are in regards to COVID and what we've been experiencing. For me, this is week 8 that I've been at home working with my kiddos, social distancing, and thinking. You can see from the slide, this came from the MTSS Fest conference they had about 2 weeks ago. George Sagai was speaking, but he spoke to this new normal that we're all experiencing. COVID has impacted all parts of our lives for the majority of people. So our work, our leisure time, financially, loved ones, I mean, literally everything, how we're getting access to food and resources. We really have created this new normal, and it's been this cultural shift. And whether that's, you know, watching something on TV with parodies of social distancing and Zoom conversations gone wrong, I mean, it's really this cultural phenomena. And I appreciate this image here that we found is mental states that you may be experiencing today, and how it's common that we could have many different emotions and feelings in one day. As Peg spoke about in her previous webinars, we really have experienced both grief and trauma systemically as a society. So we can have feelings of anxiety, maybe we can feel a little bit loopy or overwhelmed or missing people, or just gratitude and thanks for what we do have and that we're currently healthy. There's such a range of feelings, and we can go through those feelings very quickly. And it's not this linear experience, but we can go up and down. But we all know this as mental health providers. So knowing we've moved into this new COVID world, and this is not an easy situation for us, we're making it, and really is this new normal. So as you can see on this next slide, we have, let's see, a quote from listening to George Sagai speak is he spoke and he said that we can't turn on a broken light switch. And when we go back to school, so when we think about reintegration, and that last slide is we have this new normal right now for us at home. How does education look different? Our students are getting packets, or they're meeting online, or whatnot, but they've now, our teachers, our educators have been amazing to create these new cultures and these new systems for how we're communicating and supporting students virtually. And when we think about going back into the schools, this is going to be different. It's not like we went away for winter break and now we're going back. It's not like we just took a pause, but this light switch, or this school, or this kind of culture, it's different. We are going to be entering the school buildings in a different way. Our students are going to be different. Our school staff are going to be different. So the systems that we previously built and we previously had in place, those also need to reflect that, and they need to be different. So when we think just from a perspective, a systems perspective, we need to be very mindful that what we're doing is we're approaching this knowing this is different. We didn't just take a pause and go to winter break, but rather it's a new system we need to think about. So next slide. And essentially, like this quote, how are we building a new light switch? So consideration, so systems, what's already in place and what can you build on rather than recreate? So quick story for you all. I remember a couple years ago that someone came to myself and my other faculty, and they said, we want to put something in place for a local school district. We're a nonprofit, we have some grant money, we want to put this initiative in place for this local school district. Will you help us? And so my questions for them were, as I said, this is great. It's very well intentioned. They mean well. They have great efforts. It was a solid program. My thought was, what's already in place in that district? And they said, well, we don't know. I said, well, what data have you collected that there's a need for this intervention? We don't know. And I said, well, how does this fit with what they're already doing? And they said, we don't know. It's just a great program. We just want to put it in. And how many times do we feel like that as educators, as folks in education, where it's the beginning of the school year and you want to throw in one new initiative, something else new. But what we want to be very purposeful is when we think about going back to school is we're not just throwing things in. What I worry about that could happen is we're going to have a lot of very well-meaning folks who say, there's going to be trauma, there's going to be loss, there's going to be stress and anxiety. Let's just throw these things in and throw a whole bunch of initiatives at potential concerns. And we don't have data to back it up. We also don't know if it's aligned with what we're already doing. So the biggest thing I think right now is to think, what are you already doing in your schools? What's already in place? And how can you build on that? How can you use the teams you have, the initiatives like MTSS? How can you use that already rather than just bringing in new people, new initiatives, and new ideas? So being very purposeful about what you're doing. So the next point, we talk about systems and then practices. So the practices, when people come into the schools, or not when people come in, but when we think about what we're doing, again, is what we're doing evidence-based. What we do not want to see happen is have some interventions and practices put in place that could potentially be more harmful because they haven't been well thought out or well tested. Because in some ways, we're in a bit of a response mode. COVID really hit us in a way where we're reacting right now, and we weren't expecting it. So whatever we're doing, we want to make sure it's driven by data, by evidence, that it's using a trauma-informed lens, which again, Jen will talk about in our next webinar. And we're using resources from very credible sources and thinking about school counselors' roles in these 3 tiers. And then folks in education in general being mindful of those 3 tiers, which brings us to the last point, which is data. When we think about data, what data are we currently collecting now? What are we collecting when we re-enter, throughout our reintegration? And in this process, we may be going into the schools, pausing, going back online, going back into the schools, have a hybrid approach. This is a very fluid and evolving situation. As such, we need to constantly be collecting data so we know where things are, what's working, what's not working, not just for our students, but for our families and for our school staff as well. And so next slide here. I believe I'm turning it over to Jen.
Thanks, Emily. That was fantastic. So we wanted to provide you with some ideas that you can take with you back to your school teams so that you can start to think about and be really intentional about what you are doing to transition back to school. Because as Emily said, this isn't just a break. This isn't a break. And we know likely this may not be the time where you're going to be able to feel really proactive. You may want to engage in some of this work over the summer or in August as you think about heading back to school. So really wanting to provide you with some concrete things that you can leave with. And one of those is an activity we often do with school districts where you actually do some resource mapping and you think about what teams exist at your district, if you're at the district level or within your school site. What's there? Where's overlap? How can we all work together toward a common goal, which is a really successful reintegration to school for students, families, staff, etc. And so we've created a document, a resource mapping document, and have utilized this with a number of school teams in which you think about the teams, the literal teams that you have that meet on a regular basis. So it could be, often school teams have a leadership team, an MTSS team, and a hospitality team, an equity team, sometimes a wellness. There's a lot of different groups that can energize and provide ideas about how to move forward. And sometimes it just helps to have a sense of who they all are. So making your list, who's on the teams, what are their goals, what do they do? And then you can start to look for areas of overlap. You can look for areas in which the equity team may want to work in concert with the MTSS team to think about how are we going to plan some back to school activities that meet the needs of all students, staff, and families. What can we do? So that you're not duplicating efforts, but instead that you're streamlining and so that you're working toward common goals. And so this is a lovely exercise that you may want to bring back to your school principals so that you can start to think about what are some next steps. How do we energize these teams to work in concert rather than in isolation? So that's one idea that we have for you. And then as you're thinking about that, after you have a sense of, okay, here are our teams within our system, here are the different folks who are all working to get us safely back to school. then you can start to really think about, well, what do we do? How can our teams work together? How can we potentially have some shared meeting times? How can we communicate within and across teams to meet the needs of staff, students, and families? I also attended the virtual MTSS Fest and got to listen to George Sugai with Emily, and he had provided so many wonderful resources. And one of them is this planning matrix. And you also note at the top, we have a link to the YouTube keynote in which you'll get to hear it all from the master, George Sugai himself. And one document that he shared in his keynote is a way, again, and perhaps this is just me because I do feel like there's so many things outside of my control, but there are certain ways in which I can begin to organize my thoughts. And for me, as a systems thinker and as a believer in MTSS, I like to think across the tiers. So as we're planning to go back to school, what are we going to do for all kids? What are we going to do for some? What are we going to do for few? And we can start thinking about that now and translate that into what are we going to do for families? Because we know that families have been struggling with at-home virtual learning, that they may have some concerns, and that what can we do to make all families feel more comfortable with the transition back? And we can't forget our educators and our staff members who have all been engaged in this same kind of crisis response, this reaction to COVID, where they've been having to respond in different ways than they had planned. And so we get to think about, what are we going to do for all? What are we going to do for some? And what are we going to do for few? We get to think about that across time. What can we do now? Right. And some of this will likely be more crisis oriented, but then we get to look ahead, and there's hope in looking ahead. So we can think about 1 month before school. How are we going to communicate to everyone about what our plans are related to the reintegration? How are we going to be thinking about perhaps some of those students and families who haven't been as engaged in online learning, who may need some extra attention in terms of reintegration, as well as those few students who we may be quite worried about, those students and families? Are they going to need some more personal contact? Are they going to need some reaching out in a different way by different team members? And so this organizing structure may help you and your teams really be intentional. And also you get to think about, how are you going to work across teams to meet the needs of students, families, and staff as we move forward in reintegrating and going back to school. One of our colleagues, Peg Donahue, sent this visual to me, and I just loved it, because I think the underlying message for all of us is, when may we grow back, not to what was, but instead towards what we can become, really speaks to what Emily was talking about with the broken light switch. We're not going to go back to what was. We're going to go back to something new and different, which can be scary, but there's a lot of potential in that. And so as we think about our role in schools, how do we help people really be open? And yes, we get to grieve what was, but we get to look toward the future. So how do we want our school to be, even in those first few weeks, to ensure that we're ready for students, staff, and parents, and that we've created systems that will be supportive of them? So I think this may resonate with you. It may resonate with your team as a reframe to what we're all currently experiencing. So you may be thinking, yeah, that sounds great, but what are some examples? So when we're thinking about staff, what types of professional development are they going to need? Is that going to be related to trauma? Is that going to be related to social emotional learning? What are some things that we can draw upon that we can bring everybody together to the same page? And what planning can we do across curricular areas, so that we don't have individuals thinking about math over here and language arts over here and got reading over here, and we've got social emotional learning. How are we going to be planning across these different areas? And what are we going to do for students? What are some activities we're going to do? Are there any ways in which we want to utilize screening, both academic and social emotional, so we can gather data, as Emily said, to inform our practice? And what about families? Which teams are going to be communicating with families, and how are we going to do that work? So thinking intentionally across different systems will be really critical in making all of our jobs easier, and the transition more enjoyable and easier for all of us. If you can't tell, we also really have been very much into creating lists and goals. And so one final organizing structure that may be useful to you all as you head back is to think about what are your initiatives. So Emily talked about how there may be a lot of people who want to be helpful to you as a school district. What are your initiatives going to be? Okay. Are you going to focus heavily on social emotional learning? Who's going to be involved in that? And there could be a number of teams listed there, a number of players from multiple teams. What are we going to be doing? I wouldn't anticipate that this initiative list should be any longer than 1 page, because that would say that you're doing a little bit too much. But what are our focus areas for our school or our district as we consider reintegration? And how are we going to streamline what we're doing to best meet the needs of our staff and our students and our families, and be focused, so that we don't have that initiative fatigue, which so many of you probably have experienced over and over throughout your years of working in education. So again, just a way to try to help you organize what's happening and who's involved, so that you can work smarter and not harder. And finally, we've been sharing this slide in all of our webinars. We have to take care of ourselves, and so we can't do it if we're not full. So making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, making sure we're not doing it alone. So collaborating, consulting, working together. And I know all of that happens virtually right now, which can be kind of exhausting. So trying to find that balance between the number of Zoom calls that you have in a day and when you need, what are you going to do to refill in your non-Zoom life, in your world. Thinking about just our ethical obligation, making sure, as Emily stated earlier, that we're really thoughtful in vetting the material that we're sharing with student, staff, and families as we head back. There's information overload. And so again, that streamlining can be really, really important. And thinking just about how are we advocating for those who may not have a voice, or whose needs may be different than all, right? So really thinking about that some and that few, and making sure we're really cognizant of that as we head back to school. And wanting to point out there's so many resources. So we really did want to make this bite-sized because we know about your time. But ASCA has been wonderful in terms of providing free webinars and resources. And so just knowing what types of resources and webinars are going to energize you and help you plan your work is important.
All right, as we're wrapping up our few thoughts here for you all, I've been trying to run most days as a way for stress reduction and mental health. And here's a sign in my neighborhood that I pass at the end of my run. A, I like it because it's the end of the run, which means I'm almost home and I'm done running. But B, it's a little art studio for youth. And I love this sign. We're all in this together. So it gives me a sense of hope. And one thing that continues to give me hope is this sense of universality. We really are in this together. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing for your schools, your communities. It means a lot as a parent with children. It means so much to have those educators there, those mental health providers. And as a fellow mental health provider and school counselor, I'm so grateful to be in this profession with you and to see the tireless work you are doing. So thank you. I'm glad to be in this with you. So for our next couple slides, as we wrap up here, As you know, we have a number of other webinars. As a reminder, we focus on virtual school counseling by tier. We focus on crisis, grief. The one today, the big picture takeaways, thinking about the system, what's already in place that you can use, and how can you maximize your efforts, working smarter, not harder, to use what's in place so that we can address our new needs of our community in different ways, but using the same systems. And then our last webinar, our fifth and final for right now, is using trauma-informed practices. And that will be Jen. I'm excited to hear how she talks about trauma-informed practices that school counselors can do, but really everyone in the building can do according to tier. So those are the webinars. Again, they're free, they're for you. In addition to these webinars, we also have some items you can download, again, for free off of our site. So today you can see these 3 resources, the 3 matrices that we had up for you. Those you can download from our site, and we hope that they can be useful for you and for your teams. So again, thank you so much for your time today. And stay in touch. Again, Twitter, Facebook, we post things daily on both. And for more information, you can go ahead and text this number and text MTSS. And if you would like, we will send more resources to you. So thank you so much on behalf of the group, for me, Jen, and school counselors for MTSS. Thank you for all you're doing, and take good care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.